They say the ones who call you dad, the loudest, are the ones counting on you never checking their math. I used to think that was a cynical thing to say. I don't think that anymore. My name is Walter Hendricks. I'm 64 years old, and I live outside of Asheville, North Carolina, in a house I built with my own 2 hands back when my knees still let me climb a ladder without complaining. For the last 4 months, I've been carrying something heavy in my chest, and I think the only way to set it down is to tell you exactly what happened to me. It started on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was out in my greenhouse, the one I put up behind the garage after I retired from 31 years running my own HVAC business. Tomatoes, mostly. Some peppers? It's not much, but it's mine and it's quiet, and quiet is something I've come to need more than I used to. My phone rang while I had dirt under my fingernails. I saw the name on the screen and my chest did that thing it does now, that little lift it gets whenever one of my kids calls. Not my daughter, my son, Caleb, but it was my daughter-in-law's name on the screen, Renee. And Renee had married my son 8 years back. She was warm in a way that felt earned, not performed, the kind of woman who remembered your coffee order and asked about your knees before you'd even mentioned they hurt. When she called me Dad, it never felt like a formality. It felt like she meant it. I loved her the way you'd love a daughter you got to choose. I wiped my hands on my jeans and answered, "Hey, sweetheart, everything okay?" There was a pause before she spoke, and something in that pause made the hair on my arms stand up. When she finally talked, her voice was thin, stretched out, like a rubber band about to snap. "Dad, I hate to even be calling you like this. That sentence. I want you to remember that sentence, because I've replayed it in my head 1,000 times since, and I know now it wasn't the beginning of her asking for help. It was the beginning of her setting the hook." "What's wrong?" I said. "Is Caleb okay? The kids?" "Everyone's fine, I promise. It's the boutique." Renee had opened a small bridal shop in town 2 years earlier, after leaving a corporate job she used to complain about every Sunday at dinner. I'd watched her build that place from an empty storefront to something real, something with her name practically painted on the glass, even if the sign said something else. I was proud of her the way you're proud of anyone who bets on themselves and works like hell to make it pay off. "We had a supplier issue," she said. "A huge order fell through right before wedding season, and I already paid a deposit I can't get back, and now I don't have the inventory to cover the bookings we already took. If I don't fix this in the next 2 weeks, I lose the shop, Dad. I lose everything I built. My stomach dropped the way it used to when a customer called at midnight because their furnace died in a snowstorm. That old instinct kicked in, fix it now. Worry about the cost later. How much do you need?" She hesitated just long enough that I knew the number was going to hurt. 25,000. I closed my eyes. $25,000 was not something I kept lying around in a coffee can. It was a third of what I had left after Linda passed, my wife, gone 6 years now, to a heart that gave out on a Sunday morning while she was watering her ferns. That money wasn't just savings. It was supposed to be my whole future. Nursing home money, if it ever came to that. Emergency money. The kind of money you don't touch unless the world is ending. But this was Renee. This was the mother of my only grandchildren, the girl who'd sat with me in the hospital waiting room the night Linda died, who never once let me eat a holiday alone in the 6 years since. This was family, and I had spent 64 years believing that family was the one thing you didn't put a price tag on. "Renee," I said slowly, "take a breath. Tell me exactly what you need and I'll help you figure it out. I promise you, Dad, this is temporary. It's a cash flow problem, not a real problem. I have 3 big weddings booked for June and July. I just need the inventory to fulfill them. The second those deposits clear, I'll pay you back every single dollar. I swear it on the girls, or daughters, my granddaughters, and at 6 and 9 years old. The 2 little faces that lit up my whole world every time I saw them. How do you say no to a woman swearing on your grandchildren?" "All right," I said, and the relief that came pouring through the phone was so immediate, so total, that for one foolish moment it felt good to be needed like that. "I'll wire it tomorrow morning. Thank you, thank you, thank you," she said, and I could hear her crying now, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes from relief. "You have no idea what this means. Caleb doesn't even know I called you. I didn't want him to worry. He's already so stressed with work. Can we just keep this between us for now? Until I get it sorted? End quote. I told myself that was reasonable. A wife not wanting to burden her husband. A businesswoman handling her own crisis without making it a whole family production. I told myself a lot of things that spring. I hung up the phone and stood in my greenhouse a long time, the tomato vines heavy and green around me, and I felt something settle over me that I couldn't name yet. It wasn't pride. It was closer to dread, but I didn't want to look at it directly, so I turned back to my plants and told myself I was just an old man getting nervous about numbers on a screen. The next morning I drove to the bank. I watched the teller, a young man I didn't recognize, type the transfer into his computer. It's $25,000, gone from my account and into Renee's, just like that. I signed the slip of paper they handed me, and I remember thinking it was strange how such a small piece of paper could carry so much weight. Weeks went by. I didn't hear much from Renee directly, but Caleb called every Sunday like he always had, and he never mentioned any trouble. We talked about the Braves, about his job at the plant, about the girls' softball season. Normal things. I took the silence as a good sign. I figured Renee was heads down, saving her business, working the way I used to work when I had a bad season. I told myself no news was good news, and I let myself believe it because believing it was easier than asking hard questions. It was almost 2 months later when the invitation came, a text from Renee, full of exclamation points, telling me the boutique had not only survived, it had thrived. She'd landed a huge contract with a wedding planning company that booked out 3 counties, and she wanted to celebrate with the whole family, a cookout at her and Caleb's place, the Saturday after next. "Bring your appetite, Dad," she wrote. "We have so much to celebrate." I read that text sitting on my porch with a glass of sweet tea, and something in my chest loosened for the first time in weeks. My money had done exactly what it was supposed to do. I'd helped save something good. I typed back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart," and I meant every word. The day of the cookout was one of those perfect Carolina afternoons, warm without being cruel, the kind of sky that makes you forget winter ever existed. I put on my good short-sleeve shirt, the green plaid one Linda always said matched my eyes, and I drove the 25 minutes out to Caleb and Renee's place. A nice brick ranch on 2 acres they'd bought a few years back. Cars lined the driveway. I could hear music and laughter drifting from the backyard before I even got out of my truck. The yard looked like something out of a magazine, long tables draped in white cloth, a smoker going in the corner filling the whole neighborhood with the smell of pulled pork, my granddaughters chasing each other barefoot through the grass with a pack of cousins. And right in the middle of it all, holding court like a man who just won the lottery, was Caleb's brother-in-law. No. I need to slow down here, because this is where it gets complicated, and I want you to understand exactly who was standing in that yard. Renee's brother, Trent, had moved down from Ohio 2 years back to help run the boutique's books. He was younger than Renee by 6 years, smooth-talking in the way certain men are smooth-talking, the kind of fellow who could sell you your own coat back and make you thank him for it. I'd always been polite to Trent. Never had much reason to think twice about him. Renee spotted me first and came running across the grass, throwing her arms around my neck like she used to when she was newly married and still nervous about impressing her husband's father. "Dad, thank you for coming. I have so much to tell you. Congratulations on the shop, sweetheart," I said. "I'm real proud of you." She beamed, and for a second, everything felt exactly the way it was supposed to feel. Over the next hour I made the rounds, the way you do at these things, shook hands with cousins I hadn't seen since Linda's funeral, admired somebody's new truck, ate more potato salad than a man my age has any business eating. And then I ended up standing near the smoker with a paper plate in my hand, listening to Trent hold forth to a small crowd of relatives about how the boutique had been saved. "We were 3 weeks from closing the doors," Trent was saying, shaking his head like the memory still pained him. Renee had exhausted every option. Banks wouldn't touch us, the vendor wanted cash up front, and then, he paused for effect, the way a man does when he knows exactly how good his own story sounds. Her father-in-law stepped up, just wrote the check, didn't even blink. A ripple of approval went through the group. Somebody said something about what a good man I was. I felt a swell of warmth in my chest, recognition, gratitude, the 2 things every man my age secretly still wants from his family. He believed in us when nobody else would. Trent continued, gesturing toward the tables, the tent, the whole glowing party around us. This whole celebration exists because Walter here is the most generous man I know. Didn't ask for anything back. Didn't even want us to make a big deal of it. That's the kind of man he is. I stood there with a rib bone halfway to my mouth, and I felt the ground tilt just slightly under my boots. He hadn't said loan. He hadn't said payback. He'd said generous. He'd said didn't ask for anything. I told myself I'd misheard. I told myself Trent was just being dramatic, the way people get dramatic at parties, rounding the edges of a story to make it sing. I finished my plate. One. I smiled at the aunts and uncles who came up to shake my hand and tell me what a blessing I was to this family. I said, thank you, you're too kind, the whole time feeling something cold and small starting to unfurl low in my stomach. It was later that afternoon, when the light had gone long and gold and the kids were getting cranky, that I found my granddaughter Maisie's teacher Renee's closest friend, a woman named Priya who'd become close enough to the family to get invited to things like this, talking quietly by the dessert table. She caught my eye, and something in her face made me walk over. Walter, she said, lowering her voice, I just want to say, that was so generous of you. Renee told me you gave them the shop money as a gift, that you didn't want to make them feel indebted. I felt my whole body go still. A gift, I repeated. That's what she said, that you insisted on it, that you told her family doesn't keep score. Priya smiled, misreading my silence. For humility, it's just really beautiful, honestly. Not everyone would do that. I excused myself and walked to the edge of the yard, near the tree line, where I could stand with my back to the party for a minute and get my thoughts in order. Family doesn't keep score. End quote. I had never said those words. I had never said anything close to those words. What I had said, standing in my greenhouse with dirt on my hands, was I'll wire it tomorrow morning, and what Renee had said back was I'll pay you back every single dollar. I found Caleb near the cooler, pulling out a beer, and I asked him straight, quiet enough that no one else could hear. Son, what did Renee tell you about the money I sent her? Caleb's face did something complicated. She told me you offered to help out with the shop. Wanted to support her, is what she said. Why? Caleb, that wasn't a gift. She called me asking for a loan. Said she'd pay me back, once the June and July weddings cleared. My son's face went through about 4 different expressions in the space of 2 seconds: confusion, disbelief, and then something harder, something that made him look older than his 36 years. Dad, are you sure? Because that's not what she told me at all. I'm sure, I said. I've got the wire confirmation sitting in a drawer at home. He was quiet for a long moment, staring across the yard at his wife, who was laughing at something one of her cousins had said, radiant, easy, completely at home in the story she'd built. Let me handle this, Caleb said finally, his voice low. I want to tell you I let him handle it. I want to tell you I trusted my son to get to the bottom of it that very night. But I'm 64 years old, and I've been around long enough to know that a man doesn't confront a lie like this in the middle of a party, in front of 40 relatives who've already decided what story they believe. So I did what I've always done in hard moments. I kept my own counsel, finished out the afternoon, thanked the hosts, and drove home in the dark with both hands tight on the wheel. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in the bed Linda and I had shared for 38 years, and I stared at the ceiling fan going around and around, and I ran the whole conversation back through my head. The phone call, take a breath, tell me what you need. The promise, sworn on my granddaughters. The party, the applause, the word, generous, landing on me like a brand I never asked to wear. A week passed. Then too, Caleb called me on a Wednesday, his voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him before. Dad, I talked to Renee. She says she never told anyone it was a gift, that people must have just assumed. She got real defensive when I pushed. Real defensive, Dad. I wanted to believe that was possible, that this was all some misunderstanding, some game of telephone that had spiraled out of anyone's control. I wanted to believe it so badly that I almost let it go right there. But then a stranger thing happened. Almost a month after the cookout, I ran into an old customer of mine at the hardware store, a woman named Dottie whose furnace I'd replaced twice over the years. We got to talking the way you do, and somehow the conversation drifted to family, to grandkids, to the wedding season just wrapping up. Oh, I know Renee, Dottie said, brightening. My niece used her boutique for her wedding back in June. Lovely dress. Although, she paused, frowning slightly, my niece did mention it was strange. Said the shop looked half empty when she went for her final fitting. Barely any inventory on the racks. She almost had to go somewhere else last minute. And I stood there in the paint aisle with a can of primer in my hand, feeling something cold work its way down my spine. If the shop was thriving off my $25,000, why was it half empty in the middle of its busiest season? I didn't say anything to Dottie beyond a polite goodbye. But I went home and I sat at my kitchen table, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, I let myself really think like the businessman I used to be instead of the doting father-in-law I'd been playing at. I got out a legal pad. I wrote down every date I could remember: the phone call, the wire transfer, the cookout, the conversation with Caleb, the run-in with Dottie. I wrote down every promise Renee had made and every word Trent had used at that party. And the more I wrote, the clearer the shape of the thing became. I called Caleb the next morning and asked him a question I'd been avoiding. Son, who actually runs the books at that shop? There was a long pause. Trent does, he said slowly. Renee handles the front of house, the styling, the clients. Trent does all the finances. Has anyone besides Trent ever seen those books? Another pause, longer this time. No, Caleb said, not that I know of. I told him what Dottie had said. I told him about the empty racks in June. I told him I wanted to see bank statements for the business, not just take anybody's word for anything anymore. And I told him, any five, Matey Ofting and Hasses, Dottie ATA. To his credit, my son didn't defend anybody. He went quiet, and then he said the words that told me he already suspected something was wrong, something he hadn't let himself look at directly either. I've been wondering why we haven't seen any of that money come back into the house. Renee said the profits were all going straight into inventory and payroll. I never asked to see the numbers. I trusted her. I trusted her too, I said. But trust isn't the same as proof, son. Not anymore. It took Caleb almost 3 weeks to get access to the actual business account. Renee kept putting him off, saying Trent was reconciling this or finalizing that. But eventually, through the bank's own portal, using an old joint authorization from when they'd first opened the shop, my son found what neither of us wanted to find. My $25,000 had never gone to inventory. $12,000 of it had gone to Trent directly, labeled in the memo line simply as loan repayment, a debt Renee's brother had apparently run up gambling online, a debt neither Caleb nor I had ever heard existed. The rest had gone to a credit card that wasn't the business card at all, but Renee's personal one, racking up charges at furniture stores and a resort in Myrtle Beach that Caleb didn't remember ever taking a trip to. The boutique wasn't saved by my money. It was barely surviving on the actual wedding deposits coming in, propped up week to week, while my $25,000 had quietly disappeared into her brother's gambling debt and a vacation I was never invited to hear about. I sat with that for 2 full days before I did anything. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think there's a version of this story where a man my age just swallows it, absorbs the loss, tells himself, family is worth more than money, and lets it go to keep the peace. I understand that, man. I've been that man plenty of times in my life. But I kept thinking about the word, generous. I kept thinking about standing in that backyard, eating potato salad, smiling and saying you're too kind, while 40 people believed a story that was never true, built on my own silence, my own name. So I went to see David Merchant, a lawyer I'd known since our sons played Little League together 20-some years back. I laid it all out, the wire confirmation, my notes, what Caleb had found in the account. David listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, and when I finished he leaned back in his chair. Walter, you've got real documentation here, which is more than most people bring me in cases like this. But I want to ask you something first. What is it you actually want? Because there's the legal route and there's another route and they're not the same animal. I don't want to drag my son's marriage through a courtroom, I said. I don't want my granddaughters growing up hearing their mother got sued by their grandfather. But I am done being the fool in a story I never agreed to. David nodded slowly, and then let's talk about what the truth actually looks like, laid out plain, in front of the people who need to hear it. David nodded slowly. Nah. We spent 2 weeks putting it together, not a lawsuit, but a clean, factual accounting. Wire transfer, date and amount. Bank statement showing the transfer into Trent's personal account. Bank statement showing the resort charge. A short written timeline. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, just dates and numbers laid end to end so that anyone looking at it could draw their own conclusion. I decided the right place to share it wasn't a courtroom. It was Sunday dinner, the same table where Renee had spent 8 years being welcomed as my daughter, where I'd carved 100 turkeys and blown out candles on 100 cakes with those 2 little girls. I asked Caleb to invite his mother-in-law and father-in-law, people who'd been told the same generous gift story I had, Renee's parents. I wanted the truth to land with the people who'd praised me for something I never did. Renee looked confused, then wary, when she saw the folder in front of my plate before we'd even said grace. 4. Dad? What is this? This is a conversation I should have had 2 months ago, I said, and I kept my voice level, the way David had coached me to. Everyone at this table has heard, at some point, that I gave you $25,000 as a gift. I want you to know, in front of your parents, that isn't what happened. You called me in April, asking for a loan to save the shop, and you swore on your daughters that you'd pay me back. The table went silent. Renee's face drained of color. I have the wire transfer, I continued, sliding the folder toward the middle of the table. And I have the shop's own bank statements, which Caleb pulled 2 weeks ago, showing that money never went to inventory at all. $12,000 went to Trent, for what the memo line calls a loan repayment. The rest went to your personal credit card furniture, and a trip to Myrtle Beach none of us ever heard about. Renee's mother reached for the folder with trembling hands. Her father's jaw went tight the way I imagine mine had at that cookout, the exact moment a story you'd believed starts cracking open in front of you. That's not Trent needed help. I was going to pay it back from the shop. It wasn't. Renee's voice climbed, cracked, fell apart mid-sentence. I'm not here to destroy you, I said, and I meant it, even though my hands were shaking under the table. I'm here because I raised my son to believe that trust means something, and I will not sit quietly while my name gets used to cover for a lie. If you want to make this right with me, with Caleb, with your own daughter someday, that starts with the truth, not with another story. Nobody clapped. Nobody laughed. There was no applause line waiting for me the way there'd been for Trent at that cookout. There was just a long, terrible silence, and then Renee's father closed the folder gently and said, in a voice gone quiet with something like shame, Renee, is this true? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her face already had. The weeks after that dinner were some of the hardest of my life, harder in some ways than the months after Linda passed, because grief for a person is clean in a way that grief for a broken trust never is. Caleb and Renee separated not long after, not in anger exactly, but in that slow, exhausted way that happens when a foundation gives out from underneath something that used to feel solid. Trent moved back to Ohio. The boutique closed its doors that fall, quietly, without any of the fanfare that had opened it. I want to tell you it felt like winning. It didn't, not for a long time. It felt like standing in the wreckage of something I'd loved, looking at all the pieces, and understanding that some of them were never going to fit back together the way they had before. But here's what I've come to believe. Sitting out in my greenhouse most mornings now, hands back in the dirt where they belong. My granddaughters still call me every Sunday. Caleb and I talk more now than we ever did before, real conversations, not just brave scores and small talk. And about 2 months after that dinner, an envelope showed up in my mailbox with no return address, a cashier's check inside for $11,000, not the full amount but a start, and a note in Renee's handwriting that said only, I'm sorry, I'm working on the rest. Maybe she is. Maybe she isn't. I've learned I can't control what people do with the truth once you hand it to them. And all I can control is whether I stay silent while somebody rewrites who I am to serve their own story. I think about that word a lot now. Generous. It got used against me like a weapon, dressed up to look like a compliment. But I've decided I'm still going to be a generous man, because that part of me was never the problem. The problem was letting somebody else decide what my generosity meant without ever asking me first. So if you're listening to this and somebody in your own family has taken something from you and dressed it up in prettier words than it deserves, I want you to hear this from an old man who learned it the hard way. You are allowed to correct the story. You are allowed to say, That's not what happened, even if it costs you a peaceful dinner table for a while. The truth is heavier to carry for a season, but it's a whole lot lighter than a lie you have to keep smiling through for the rest of your life.